I'm going to begin today's class by giving you some unsolicited advice about reading. And the advice is this. The starting point of the advice is the observation that the further you go in your education, the less you can entrust your education to school, to courses, to professors, to the whole apparatus of the university. The university is good at some things and bad at other things. What it's good at is teaching you the skills to solve discrete problems in particular domains. How to translate German, how to solve problems in mathematical physics, or so forth. What the university is bad at is thinking and assisting you in the activity of the imagination. And in this spirit, the most important thing that you can do for yourselves is to redress the most common defect in the education of educated people, which is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy is the history of the most fundamental ideas in our civilization, and it is a problem which you should be able to address by yourself. And in that way support the most important part of your education from now on, which is your self-education. Now, there are two methods that I recommend to you. One method is to study the history of philosophy, and by far the best history in English, or so far as I know, in any language, in any modern language, is Frederick Copplestone's History of Philosophy. Copplestone was an upper-class English Jesuit, and his History of Philosophy is unique because of its extraordinary self-restraint. Copplestone does not profess to tell you who's right, who's wrong, what's good, what's bad, except, of course, the very important element of selection, which is implied in his choice of the subjects of his history. His history is available in 9 volumes. All are in paperback, all are readily accessible on Amazon, and you can easily read all of them in a single summer. And in this way, solve this problem. So that you can, as it were, embark on a rocket and leave the gravitational field of the ideas of your time, of your milieu, and not depend on the intellectual fashions in which your professors traffic. Be sure when you prepare to embark on this rocket that you do not fail to hear Voltaire's voice mocking you from the grave. Those who lack the spirit of their time will nevertheless have all of its defects. Proceed nevertheless onto the rocket, and you'll be enormously glad that you did. Now, the second method that I recommend is to choose a single philosopher and read everything he ever wrote, and begin to form your mind in dialogue with his. And that's the other way in which you can develop your intellectual independence. The choice of this philosopher is, of course, a matter of discretion. It's not necessarily a philosopher with whom you sympathize. It could be the opposite, a philosopher whom you antagonize. For example, in my experience, I find our subject today, Schopenhauer, immensely interesting because in many respects, his way of thinking is the inverse of mine. So that's the other method that I recommend to you. And this can have a revolutionary effect on your studies, on your way of thinking, and on your approach to the specialized disciplines that you study in the course of your formal education. That's all I wanted to suggest to you. Are there any questions? Would someone like to discuss any part of that advice? It's really very easy to implement. And although it may seem a lot, it's really quite modest compared to the other things you do in your education, which take inordinate amounts of time and threaten to consume all of your attention to very little effect. All right. Any questions again? Do you want to add any observation, Michael?
I will simply add first a full agreement. This is absolutely something I would recommend as well. One other suggestion I would make for the Chinese philosophical tradition, there is one work I would also recommend. It is shorter, just a 2-volume work. It is by Feng Youlan, so it's spelled F-E-N-G, new word, Y-U, it's an old spelling for those of you who know Mandarin, /L-A-N. Feng Youlan. He does exactly like Copplestone does. He just takes you through the major philosophers, explains what their basic positions are.
Yes, because Copplestone is a history only of Western philosophy.
Yes.
Nothing else.
Exactly. And Feng Youlan is very much doing the same with the Chinese philosophical tradition. One very quick thing I should mention, if you do read Feng Youlan, let me say a very few quick words about his political, I should say rather his historical moment. So he is writing this book to make an argument that the Chinese philosophical tradition is a philosophical tradition and should be taken seriously. Hopefully that is no longer as much of a question mark, but at the time, in the early 20th century when he's writing this, that was very much a question mark. And that does affect the nature of the writing. So he will spend lots of time making arguments for when you find moments in the Chinese philosophical tradition that seem very closely paralleled to something in the Western tradition. So he'll discuss one group called the Mohists, and he will point out how incredibly similar they are to the development of logic in the Greek tradition, which, by the way, in that example is certainly true. The reason he's doing that, of course, is that he feels that he is in a situation where to make an argument that we should take Chinese philosophy seriously, he needs to show it's every bit as good as the Western tradition, which means you don't get as much, perhaps, of what would be somewhat more exciting, which is what are the new exciting things that the Chinese philosophical tradition brings to the table that should challenge some of our assumptions. Nonetheless, that is certainly there. It just isn't as highlighted as strongly. I mention this just to say, when you're reading it, don't get too frustrated when you get the, oh, and this is like Kant, oh, and this is like, like Aristotle. Keep reading, because he definitely brings out the exciting parts, even though it's not what he will rhetorically most strongly emphasize.
I should also add, in that regard, that the professoriate in general looks down on the reading of secondary works, like a history of philosophy. And they take the position that you should only read the original sources. This is an absurd form of intellectual snobbery, and you should pay absolutely no attention to it. It really makes no sense at all. Shall we go ahead?
Absolutely.
Okay. So. Yes.
Thank you. Apologies again about the acoustics, but the microphone does help a little bit. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, just for the
The
second.
most important thing is to shout.
The microphone helps only a little.
Okay, so projecting. For the second method, where you're just reading one author and you're reading all of their works, a lot of these authors are in conversations with other authors. Do you think that you need to then sort of be like, okay, I need to understand Hegel to understand Marx, or just focus on Marx, see what he has to say?
It could be. That depends on who you select.
Okay.
And of course, you're led naturally from the study of one to the study of another. It's really just a starting point.
Okay. So starting point, and then you dig deeper.
And then if you
lifelong
have
pursuit.
read previously or are reading the history of philosophy as a whole, like Copplestone, that allows you to place the author you're reading in a larger context.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
exercise, but yeah, one in the back.
Hi, I was curious about why just the history of philosophy. What about the history of religion or the history of literature in sort of helping us to understand great ideas broadly conceived? Yeah.
Because the reason is that is the conception of philosophy. So the old classical conception of philosophy, as I mentioned, I think, in one of the early classes, was it's a super science. It's a science of the fundamentals. This super science doesn't exist. We have no direct access to the framework of everything. So that's not the reason to prefer philosophy. It's because philosophy conducted in a spirit of high ambition is a discipline which represents, as it were, the reserve powers of the human mind. The powers that it does not subcontract to the specialized disciplines. And in this spirit, in the spirit that we should have, in the attitude that we should have to it, it's the mind at war. It's the mind insisting on its prerogative to speak to the things that matter most, that are almost unthinkable and almost unsayable, that is proceeding at the frontiers of our capabilities. That's what philosophy is. So it's not the old super science pretending to reveal the secrets of reality, but it's also not the degenerate enterprise of contemporary analytical philosophy of being a thought police, which is simply monitoring the rights and wrongs of different styles of argument. So on that view, and on the assumption that all the great thinkers, to one or another extent, embody this idea of rebellion, of refusal to accept the disciplinary limitations, that's the reason to study philosophy. That's what I think. Yes?
But what about something like Middlemarch by George Eliot, or, for example, Don Quixote by Cervantes?
Of course. Literature, great literature, is one of the main sources of our insight into humanity. And so this is not the idea that we would replace the reading of literature by the study of philosophy. It's simply focusing on the discursive parts of our thought, the attempt to form these systematic conceptions. In art, of course, the insights are implicit in the particulars. So it's a different form of apprehension, but irreplaceable and enormously valuable. So to understand humanity or our conceptions of humanity, of course, everyone has to know Shakespeare and Dante and Milton and the 19th and 20th century novel. That's the history of our spiritual experience. But philosophy is trying to put this in ideas that we can argue about. Yes?
Well, secondary sources. So, I mean, we have steady guides like Copleston, but then when we're confronted with sort of an area of inquiry where we don't know much about the secondary literature either, what's a good starting point? Because I feel like the secondary literature can also lead.
Well, but now a secondary literature about what? About philosophy? Well, the real secondary literature about philosophy is the history of philosophy. Otherwise, what is it? I mean, in contemporary philosophy, there's the pretense that there's a kind of analytical science. It's a false pretense anyway. The real secondary literature in philosophy is its history. So exactly what my recommendation was. Yes?
How would you boil down Western philosophy in sort of broad paradigms, the way that you could break down the science into broad paradigms?
You mean what are the main traditions in? Well, this too we briefly addressed, and I suggested that in the global history of philosophy, there are two major traditions. There's the Greek philosophy of being, the Aristotelian philosophy, which is the main thing in the West, which has the notion that there is an ultimate structure of natural reality, the basic constituents of nature, and that this ultimate structure is in turn governed by immutable laws, symmetries, and constants. That's the tradition that continues through 20th century physics. And it recognizes the reality of time, but it says something is outside of time. What's outside of time is this basic structure and the regularities governing it. So it equivocates about the reality of time. That, I would say, is the basic tradition. The other major tradition in the world history of philosophy is the one we address today, speculative monism. The idea that the distinctions among things are ephemeral or illusory, and ultimately there's one reality, a unified reality which is timeless. So, and that's the tradition that we have in the Upanishads, in the philosophers of Buddhism like Nagarjuna, and that is represented most unequivocally in the history of Western philosophy by the philosopher we study today, Schopenhauer. To a lesser extent, by Plato, Plotinus, the Stoics, and in another way by Leibniz and Spinoza. Those are the two main traditions. And then I made the observation, I made the claim, that there would be a third tradition, which I call temporal naturalism, which says everything is indeed ephemeral, but no less real on account of being ephemeral. And that's a tradition that is partially represented by a dissident line of philosophers in the history of philosophy, like Heraclitus, Hegel, and in the 20th century, Whitehead and Bergson. It's the one that would seem to have the greatest purchase on reality, at least I think so, but it speaks with the weakest voice in the history of philosophy. So that's one way, one very simple way of understanding these paradigms. But of course, there are an infinite number of ways of slicing this up, depending on your philosophical perspective. Any other questions? Okay. So in today's argument, I want to proceed in stages, in parts. First, I want to address a set of ideas that precedes the birth of speculative monism, but had immense importance in the history of ideas in the world. It's what I'm going to call the Indo-European formula. Then I'm going to speak to this philosophy of the timeless one as a way of understanding reality. And then about the ethical project, the ethical agenda, the orientation to existence, the how we should live that arises from it, and the evaluation and criticism of those ideas. And finally, I'm going to end my argument today by posing a question to you. So first, what we study today is the basic character of this second major tradition in the world history of philosophy, the tradition of the timeless one. Reality is ultimately unified. The distinctions among things and their changes, their apparent transformations, are either superficial or altogether illusory. Because the real thing is unitary and outside of time. Now, where this tradition emerged most forcefully in ancient India, it emerged initially out of a historical background that had a different focus. And the focus was studied in great detail by the comparative philologists in the 19th and 20th century. And I especially single out one of them. I put his name here on the board, Georges Dumézil, who studied this Indo-European formula. Now let me describe the formula. The idea is that in society, there are three main classes or castes. There are the priests or thinkers on top. Then second, there are the rulers and fighters. And third, there are the workers. An ordered society is a society that preserves this hierarchy and these divisions. And the hierarchy in society has a correspondence to the hierarchy in the soul. There is a form of soulcraft that corresponds to this statecraft. The hierarchy in the soul are at the top. There are rational capacities, are capacities of thought and understanding. Under them, there are the action-oriented impulses, like courage. And at the bottom, there are the carnal appetites, the sensual appetites. And according to the Indo-European formula, there is a correspondence and equivalence between the social hierarchy and the hierarchy in the soul. Of course, the rational capabilities and passions correspond to the priests and thinkers. The action-oriented impulses to the fighters and rulers, and the carnal appetites to the workers. And the idea is that the right understanding of the world is essential to preserve and sustain both of these hierarchies and their intimate relations to each other. Now, it's extraordinary because in its essentials, this formula can be found also at the beginning of Western philosophy, not just in Central Asia, Southern Asia, but also in Western Asia. We find it in the philosophy of Plato, in the middle dialogues of Plato, like the Republic, and combined there with another element in the Indo-European formula, which is the doctrine that we know often in the West as the doctrine of karma, but which also appears in the Republic in the myth of Ur at the end of the dialogue. So the individuals have fates, and these fates continue after their death and are re-embodied in their successors. And the formula is really, I have to say, speaking frankly and without restraint, it's monstrous. Because, you know, in Joyce's Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus says, history is a nightmare from which I want to awake. And here we have the universal history, the cosmological history. The history from which we would want to awake is not just human history, it's the history of the whole cosmos. In this monstrous distribution of fates to everyone in the world. And that's then the basis of reality and of our projects. That's the background. From that background, there began to emerge the philosophy of the timeless one, which we can also call speculative monism. In the period of the Upanishads and of early Buddhism. And it is a theory which was predominant in the ancient India of that time, but is represented in the history of the West by a few philosophers. To a limited extent, Spinoza and Leibniz, but much more radically and completely by Schopenhauer. It has two forms, it has two variants. The radical variant, which Schopenhauer certainly represents, and a qualified variant. The qualified variant, which we have, for example, in Plato, and to some extent in Plotinus, says the distinctions and changes among things are not entirely illusory, but they are epiphenomenal. They are superficial. The ultimate reality, the reality of the ideas in Plato, is beyond time and beyond distinction. So the epiphenomenal realities achieve whatever reality they have by participating in this ultimate reality. Now, there is a problem with this view as a way of understanding the world. And the problem is that it seems to allow us no way to engage with natural reality. Because to engage with natural reality, we need causation. And because we need causation, we also need time. It gives us no wedge with which to penetrate reality. And there's an additional problem, an accessory problem, which is this. It is never explained in this philosophy of the timeless one, in either its radical or its qualified form, why it is that nature should disguise itself in this fashion and appear to the human mind in a form that negates its reality. Why? It's like a detour. What is the purpose of this cognitive detour? Now then we can develop further the argument about the philosophy of the timeless one by contrasting it with a position which early in the course I called temporal naturalism. And temporal naturalism just is the view that time is for real, all the way real. And it includes everything. There is no set of ultimate constituents of nature or of stable laws, constants, and symmetries that is outside of time. Everything is in time, and everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. And that view was regarded in the Aristotelian philosophy and the tradition of the Greek philosophy of being, which, as I said, continues until 20th century physics, as a condition for any kind of understanding, because they thought if the laws can float, if they can change, then all bets are off. And there's no ultimate touchstone of reality by which we can understand and judge the rest. Now, we might question that objection by evoking the example of a modern science, the science, the earth and planetary sciences, and what we used to call natural history. Because natural history is characterized by three tenets, three claims that are characteristic of what I'm calling temporal naturalism. The first is the mutability of types. There is no permanent stock of types of being, no permanent typology in natural history, in the earth and planetary, in the planetary and life sciences. And notice that the claim is not just with respect to living things. It doesn't depend on life, on vitality, because it extends to geological history, or for example, to the history of crystals. It has a scope which is larger than the scope of living things. So there's no, according to this view in natural history, there's no fixed stock of types. The stock of types can be enlarged and is enlarged perpetually. The second claim is the claim of the looseness of causal chains, also known under the name of hysteresis. So, for example, in the life sciences, the relation between natural selection, the constraints imposed by the available stock of body types, and the floating of the continents on the surface of the oceans studied by plate tectonics. The point is that they're all independent of each other. Ultimately, you could say everything is related to everything else, but there's no proximate causal link. Let me give you an example to show what I mean. Suppose that we try to understand why the main line of mammalian evolution goes through the placentals rather than through the marsupials. Now, it turns out that the crucial element there was that the marsupials were isolated in a part of the world that became separated from the rest and ultimately turned into Australia. And they then developed under a different set of competitive forces, natural evolution. There's no relation between the logic of natural selection and the factors that shaped the floating of the continents studied by plate tectonics. So there's this looseness and this element of brute contingency in the historical evolution that comes from the distinction among the different causal chains. Now, the claim being made by temporal naturalism is that these are not just features of natural history. This is the feature of the whole history of the universe. The whole thing is like this. And the exception is the middle level of the study of these large bodies, large-scale astronomy, which is confounded with cosmology. So on this view, cosmology is a historical science. It sees nature as having the attributes which I just attributed to things at the macroscopic scale of natural history. And there's no necessary connection between the explanatory ambitions of science and this idea that there is a stable, immutable set of laws and types of being. That's just to show what's at stake in this debate. So in any event, the theory of the timeless one, the radical or the qualified version of speculative monism, does affirm this idea that the more real something is, the less time-bound it is. And reality then is associated with timelessness and immutable structure, in opposition to the claims of historical consciousness, which affirms that with respect to all of nature, history comes before structure rather than the other way around. Now, one feature of the speculative monism in this view of reality is that there's a relation between the external world, the objective world, and the world of experience. And this is why this is called a dual aspect theory. So Schopenhauer's view of the timeless one was an example of this dual aspect theory. In the old Indian philosophy, it was the relation between Brahman, the ultimate reality of the timeless one, and Atman, the instantiation of this ultimate reality in the individual self. Schopenhauer had a view of that kind. Now, what is the moral project that is supported by this view? The moral project is one that proposes an ethic of serenity and benevolence. So Schopenhauer says, we are tormented by insatiable desire on this treadmill of one desire after another, this torture of wanting more and more. And we are divided from one another by struggle. So Schopenhauer remarks in his masterwork, at any given time in the world, hundreds of thousands, millions of animals are tearing each other apart alive in order just to live a little bit longer. But they're going to die anyway. That's the terrible spectacle that we see before us in nature. And we should get off this treadmill through the disciplines recommended by the speculative monism, which are essentially three. The first is the concentration and purification of the mind, of consciousness, trying to expel all extraneous material and focus on the ultimate reality and see all the epiphenomena, all the illusions, from the standpoint of this ultimate reality. The second discipline is a disinterested view of reality. And the disinterested view of reality, the one in which we're able to look at the world and try to understand it without being motivated by some interest, he associates with art. And not only with art, but he says with children. Children are joyful because they are disinterested, he says, thus betraying how little acquaintance he had with children. And the third discipline is altruistic compassion, benevolence, The basis of benevolence in that philosophy is the ultimate unity of everyone. Because we're not really different, and when we understand that we're all the same, we're all part of the same reality, we will abdicate from the passions that divide us. Now, what in general are the main criticisms that one might try to mount against the view, not as a cognitive view, which I discussed before, but as an ethical view? And of course, any such criticism presupposes marshaling the ideas of another tradition, another way of thinking against this one. So in that sense, it is unfair, but it's an unfairness which we can't escape in the debates of world philosophy. So the first and basic criticism is that the result of this attempt to achieve invulnerability, serenity, seems to be a diminishment of life. We raise the shield. The price of raising the shield is to live less. And it seems paradoxical that in order to cope with the terrors of our mortality, of death, we should, as it were, die beforehand. Because vitality arises from engagement, from connection, and therefore from risk and vulnerability. Now, the second main criticism to level against the moral project is that there seems to be a contradiction between the cognitive antidote to nihilism and the practical antidote to nihilism. Nihilism is the belief that our lives, that the world and our lives and the world itself are meaningless, which throws us then into melancholia and despair, into a philosophical delirium. The theoretical antidote is to say, it doesn't matter. You're going to die, but you never really lived. You never had this separate existence in which you trust. And all the objects of desire are false. This false glitter, this false gold that you're chasing after. That's a theoretical antidote to nihilism. The practical antidote to nihilism is connection, engagement. And in that regard, let me read to you then a famous passage from David Hume, from a completely different philosophical tradition, but revealing the essential view of this contradiction between the theoretical and the practical antidote. Where am I, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence? And to what condition shall I return? I am confounded with all these questions and begin to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty. Most fortunately, it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine. I play a game of backgammon. I converse and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find it in my heart to enter into them any farther. So there you have the idea. The true antidote to the melancholy is action and connection and parting. Parting is the answer to nihilism. So that's the other objection, the other major objection to the moral agenda. So that's where we leave the debate. And now I want to end my remarks by posing a question, which is a variant of the question of what we called early in the course the cognitive gap. The cognitive gap is this. We're examining these orientations to existence here in the course, and we're claiming that we can reason about them. There are reasons to criticize one or criticize the other. We can attempt to evaluate them. And what are some of these reasons? So one reason is, do the assumptions of the orientation to existence that we're studying reconcile? Do they combine with what we independently know to be the facts about our lives, about the world, about nature? Second, do they correspond to our most intense and persistent desires, our longings? Do they do justice to who we are and to what we really want? And third, are they stabilizing or are they self-subversive? In other words, either psychologically or politically, when we act on them, do they then tend to make the world more like what they say it is, or does the opposite happen? So all of these orientations to existence have to some extent the character of self-fulfilling prophecies. Each of them is a promise of happiness. Each of them says, act as if I were true, and you will make the world more like what I say it is. But they're not completely self-fulfilling prophecies. Reality fights back, and reality may refuse to oblige. So that's the other criterion by which we can assess their merits, their reality. So then the claim of the cognitive gap is that with respect to the most important decision we can make, which is how we should live, we can reason, we can make arguments, but there is a disproportion between the vital importance of the question and the inadequacy or incompleteness of the arguments. So it's not that we can't reason, it's that our reasoning, so far as it can go, always seems disproportional to the outcome. That's the cognitive gap. Now, consider a metaform, as it were, of the cognitive gap, which arises from the choice about basic attitudes to life and to the nature of the world. So, one attitude was the attitude taken by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer asked, is life worth living? And he answered, no, it's not worth living. He gave an unequivocal answer to his own question. And he cites all of these horrific instances of what reality is like. He says, look at the Australian giant ant that divides in two And then each of the two parts, the head and the tail, start to devour each other. That's the nature of reality. There's this brute force which destroys everything, which negates everything. That's the essence of reality. And we're just pretending that that's not the case if we try and hide from that. Then there's the attitude of the Christian philosophers, and above all the Christian poets, say Dante Alighieri, for example. They tell us, we have a friend who's in charge of the universe. The person or the force in charge of the universe is our friend, and he's motivated by love. Love is the essential element of reality. So that's a second attitude. Now there's a third attitude, which is especially associated with ancient Chinese philosophy, which was the predominant element of which was a kind of anti-metaphysical metaphysic, as we see in Confucianism. That's the one that on its face seems to be the most sane. And says, the world is neither in favor of us nor against us. It's mainly just indifferent to us. We're irrelevant in the world. It presents dangers, it has benefits. We can try and use it to bring it to our side to some extent, but always understanding that there's a fundamental discontinuity between ourselves and the world. And that's the third attitude. Now, my question to you is simply this. What should we do about the choice among these fundamental pre-philosophical attitudes which color all of our cognitive and practical orientations? We might say, well, we're more inclined to one or to the other by virtue of our temperaments. So some people are sanguine and hopeful. Others are like Schopenhauer, embittered and angry. What should we do? Should we just deliver ourselves to our characters or our personalities? Should we pretend that we can fight against them? Can we marshal to some extent our reflections so that we're not totally in the hands of our genetic, social, and cultural fate? And there we have what I call the cognitive gap, with a vengeance at a higher level. Because if we have so little chance of resolving by reason the choice among the particular orientations, what chance can we hope to have of resolving by reason the choice among these fundamental pre-philosophical orientations? And that then is the question that I pose to you.
Let us open this up for conversation. Oh, great.
Well, doesn't it matter? I mean, doesn't it matter whether Dante's view is correct? That no, it doesn't matter?
I just don't think that, well, I understand that the cognitive gap is that we can't determine what matters over the other thing, but perhaps that's the reason to think less about this whole thing in general.
Well, it seems to me that if you think that the universe is in the charge of a friend of ours, and that this friend is motivated by universal love, the question is how you can collaborate with him, how you can participate in him. Now, then the theology may say you're destined to live in eternal beatitude alongside of him, which we all desperately want not to happen, right? But it points our lives in a different direction. And not just our lives, but the whole organization of society. I mean, you could say, but of course that requires some idea of consistency. And you could say, well, dismiss the idea of consistency. And then do what? Just follow your impulses?
I think if these impulses seem consistent with what we, like what the individual considers themselves to be, then any of these orientations is likely to be equally satisfied insofar as they seem consistent with others. Which means that there's a wash in terms of whatever a single person in society chooses. But it is personally satisfied if you choose to align.
No, but look, consider it from this angle. I awake during the day, I have a moment of reflection and say, suddenly I think, why am I here? What does this mean? And I might say, the world is a nightmare. It's a nightmare that Schopenhauer describes. What can I do to diminish my losses? And I'm going to get off this treadmill of desire as much as I can. I'm going to take a disinterested attitude to the world, so the things that might otherwise seem terrible to me will just seem curious. And in this way, I'll try and cast a spell on myself, and the spell of serenity. Or I could say, no, there's a providential conflict, and I'm either on the side of love or I'm not, and I can collaborate with it or not, and that's fate. That's my fate. I only have this one brief life. Where will I stand? Now, Dante says in the comedy, he puts in limbo, in the first circle of hell, those who say neither yes nor no. And they don't take a position. But that's already a condemnation for the Christian poet, though it might not be for someone who has the first philosophical attitude. Now, the Chinese naturalist might be impatient with this discussion and say, we can't resolve any of this. Let's, as a practical matter, make nature more useful to us and diminish its terrors. Let's build from the ground up, little by little, the small part of the world that we can affect. And then we'll make things better that way. But that's another attitude, which gives up the hope of transforming this into a large drama in which the small moves have large consequences in our minds. So don't we have to choose? Yes, I want you to respond.
I think we ultimately have to choose. I agree that there are different, like, practical differences in our lives depending on one choice or the other. I think given that we can't say one choice is better than the other, the maximum satisfaction that an individual can gain from their choice is how much they think it aligns with their own values, in which case it is a completely internal process. For example, if I think of the example like Stephen Dedalus, part of me thinks that maybe he finds some satisfaction being this like brooding intellectual guy, even if that is not like an actually satisfactory living, but he likes it insofar as it's consistent with himself. And so I agree that there are tangible differences in the life that we choose. I think that is important. I think it's hard to determine what exactly is important about it, in which case the onus rests on the individual to find the best choice.
Okay.
I tend to agree with my classmate. I think it's an incredibly subjective experience, and I think the main question is what's going to motivate you to wake up in the morning and do each thing. And I think in the same way, like for example, when you have a child, sorry, up more, okay. Yeah, but for example, like in the way that you like discipline a child to make sure they're having socially desirable behavior, either you have the idea of a benefit, like a reward or a punishment, and I see it very similarly like in Christian theology or overall philosophy, like the idea of benefit and punishment is very clear. And I think in a more Schopenhauer regime, the way that I see it is like, if all of it comes to a wash and there will be a point where you as the ultimate subject doesn't exist anymore, then all of the things, good or bad, will also cease to exist. And that could also be a motivating thing in the sense of no matter how bad something is or good, it all comes out to a wash. Where I struggle in this kind of like, I do see it as a subjective internal motivation. Where I struggle more with it is in the Confucian philosophy and how that might play into this kind of driving force for individuals.
So, yeah, let me hold off on the last part of the question about the Confucian side, because we will get to it in detail just a few weeks. But touching on the former points, yeah, part of this touches on the previous question too. Part of what makes this so difficult, and yet we would argue so incredibly important, is minus posing these questions, we will tend to simply live our lives according to customs we're born into, assumptions of the self we're born into, patterns that we happen to fall into, that will largely define our existence and largely define the social orders we are part of, largely define the kinds of lives we will lead, largely define how we will raise the next generations, which will largely be just sort of repetitions of the same. So one thing that all three of these traditions would share that we're discussing in this course would be to say, the reason you pose these questions is, at the minimum, it forces us to challenge our most basic assumptions. Now, it is possible we may do this exercise and come to the opinion that, oh, actually the world we've currently built is acceptable. I think that's unlikely, but to give a slightly more possible view, the argument could be, well, the visions of the self that we have come to accept are onto something. We just need to follow out the larger implications and work out what it would truly mean to live life this way. Or conversely, some of these ideas, which will challenge everything we assume, may turn out to be the more powerful ones. Either way, what you are doing is no longer living a life in which you're simply accepting the world we're born into, accepting customs we happen to be following, accepting habits that we fell into from a very young age. At the very minimum, you're forced to actually break all of these assumptions and rethink how we should live our lives, even if a piece of that would end up being a support for how we live our lives, but it might end up being a pretty radical rejection. And that is something I think all three of these, we've only discussed two so far, we'll get to the Confucian one in a few weeks, but all three of these would strongly say that's why you do this, even though, getting back to the heart of Roberto's point, there's never going to be a clear, rational ground for making a decision amongst them. But they at least would all agree with that fundamental challenge that we should undergo.
Yes, but the question is whether there's some constructive force. Because it's not that you have adequate rational ground. That's the point of the cognitive gap, right? There are cognitive grounds to do this or to do that, but they seem incomplete.
Right, and
Crucially incomplete.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because each requires a set of foundations that the other would fully, totally, completely reject. Yes. I mean, each of these would say that about the other.
But apart from the issue of whether they would be accepted by the others, the real question is whether they would be accepted by us, who are trying to complete an argument, a moral argument or a political argument, or even a natural argument in one particular direction. Not whether we can satisfy the proponent of some other philosophical view, but whether we can satisfy ourselves.
But I mean, I would argue we can't. Not that
Yes.
we shouldn't, but the point is that we will never have the foundations for deciding, even if we decide, okay, I'll give a random number. 1, 2, 3. Even if we randomly decide, okay, I will go for number 2, whichever these three options that, whatever these three options that is, the point is there will never be a foundation by which I could justify that, even if I weren't aware of the other two. Hopefully knowing the other two opens up the power of rethinking that decision, questioning my assumptions.
And in reality, what happens is that the vast majority of people have the beliefs of their milieu.
Precisely.
Or of their parents.
Precisely.
And the beliefs that they acquire from their family.
Precisely.
And so they live in by this false light.
Yes.
So philosophy is really what happens when we deny ourselves the false light and insist on something more than that. I'm not going to live just by the predominant idea of my society, my culture, or the beliefs of my parents. I'm going to try and make sense of the world and of myself. That's the moment of philosophy.
Yes. And all three would absolutely agree with that position, despite their radically different answers. Yes.
Sorry, one more follow-up.
Of course.
Particularly if we're doing it under this kind of mode of it's very difficult to kind of justify when people would opt into each one. Under Schopenhauer, what kind of distinctions would an individual, like what benchmark would you use between moral and immoral behavior, or like just simply hedonism, or complete like nihilistic resignation of just things will happen, none of it means anything in the end?
Well, moral behavior is the behavior that accords with reality, because the moral reality is subservient to the natural or metaphysical reality. And according to Schopenhauer, the metaphysical reality is that we're not really distinct from one another. We're all one. And therefore, it is acting in the spirit of being the instances of that one that we would be moral. Does that satisfy you?
Well, let me just add to this by saying, even within each of these three, the debates as to how to answer the question you're asking are incredibly intense. So just sticking with this example, so Schopenhauer, as Roberto has argued, very much sees himself, and correctly sees himself, as coming out of the Upanishads, to some degree coming out of Buddhism, very much arguing what he would see as the moral implications of that view. Now, the truth is, if you were to put Schopenhauer in conversation with most Buddhists, they would say, this is, not only would they say this is not Buddhism, they would strongly reject his way of reading the implications of his own philosophical position. And what I mean by that is the following. So Schopenhauer's move is to say, very much like we saw last week, the world of our experience is a product of the will. That will is completely imbued in our desires. We construct this false world out of the will, which again is really coming out of our most base desires. He then works out the full implications of how to understand the entire cosmos in this way. And the implication, exactly as Roberto has said, is, and therefore I should cease my striving and cease the use of the will. Now, of course, note the difference. In Buddhism, as we were discussing last week, the argument is absolutely the world of our experience is a construct of the will. That will is inherently based on our most grotesque base desires, and absolutely, we should break down that will and break down the world that is created, beginning with this self that is we think existent and actually creating this horrific world. However, note the differences. In Buddhism, the argument is that world we are creating is one in which we are creating enormous suffering around us. We don't see it because we're constructing this world for our own happiness and pleasure. We're Siddhartha in his palace, not realizing the implications of that world we're building, and the implication for Buddhism of breaking that will and breaking the self that is creating this world is this absolute universal compassion toward all living creatures, trying to help them from the world of suffering. Note Schopenhauer's argument on the contrary. Now, to be fair, Schopenhauer does say, since all is
Universal
one,
compassion.
yes, we must have universal compassion. He does say that, and if you actually trace his career, he plays that out to some extent. However, you've read, even though an excerpt, you've gotten a sense for Schopenhauer, that's a pretty minimal part of his philosophy. What he really will do, and we know this from a lot of his contemporaries, he spends a lot of his days in his room being fed by servants listening to music, which he sees as a mode of detachment from the world. And of course, from a Buddhist perspective, that is Siddhartha in his palace. That is total selfishness. That is not universal compassion. That is, I'm kicking back, being fed by servants, enjoying beautiful music. I mean, he would take out the beautiful part, but that for him is his mode of rejecting the will. So I mentioned all of this in answer to your question. Even within those who would strongly support the second position we were discussing, there is going to be intense debates as to what it means to fully live up to these ideas and, getting back to the heart of your question, the moral implications of the different ways of reading it. And already, just in these 2 weeks, we see two pretty different readings of these same basic ideas.
So it's important to understand why this position has had such a long life in the history of humanity, because it arises from three main sources, right? One is the spectacle of the impermanence of everything. The world is constantly melting before us, and and the interpretation that they give is it's because it's not real. Those are false distinctions. It's not the necessary interpretation. There's the other one suggested by temporal naturalism. The second source is the torture of insatiability. The experience of being alive is the experience of endless desire. When one desire is fulfilled, there's either boredom or another desire. And it never ends, this torture. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the experience of consciousness. So we have the experience of consciousness is like the light in physics. It's unified and then diffracted in different places, like mental life is diffracted in different minds, but it seems to be a single thing. And that's why we can understand other people and we can study ancient cultures or distant cultures. The experience of the unity of consciousness, that's the third factor, which inspires this view. So the view is an interpretation of these fundamental aspects of experience. It's not entirely capricious, but it does push things in a particular direction. And the question is what we make of that direction. Do we resist it or not?
Yes, please.
I thought some of these questions were really good, but to take the point of subjectivity, satisfaction, or being the person who judges what it is that gives value, it is not as if these ideas of subjectivity are naturally occurring. These ideas of subjectivity were posited. They have a historical position, and from there, subjectivity gets constructed one way or the other. I think there was a question last week as well. Can we substantiate the oneness? Or can we substantiate that the individual is indeed connected with the world? And that substantiation is actually very obvious to notice, because we are consuming food that is not part of us. It nourishes us, it becomes us, and then we discard waste that ceases to be us. So this understanding of the self is a very contingent one based on certain received ideas of philosophy. And the movement in philosophy has been to narrow the domain of humanity over and over again. So how is it that we posit a certain idea of humanity is by the sort of separation or negative self-definition of what it is that we create a distinction with. So even taking something like time, time is not something that is apparent, but it is a construct, it is an instrument. And actually, depending on who you ask, you can have three totally different understanding of time. Time is just a coordinate to find a certain arrangement of things in space. Time as duration, which is to imbue a story between two different arrangements, two different possible arrangements. And that is the understanding of time as duration or narrative. So even something like history, for the longest time, was that historian knew two different things in 2 points of time, and the only logic or reason that the historian was well-versed in was this thing of causality. So those two things became a historical narrative. Similarly, there are narratives of the self. Narratives of the self about what it means to be in a certain way that are, as Professor pointed out, they're received. So the idea that satisfaction or fulfillment or whatever it is to be called, it happens in a certain way. And modern societies, again, these are just conceptual categories to be used and then immediately discarded, as one of our friends pointed out in the last lecture. So working with that category, what is the life of modern man is that you grow up in a certain way, you're told that you're an individual. I mean, think about the concept of individualness as such. And then you live your life as an individual. You're not listening to others because you think what the self is to be found within and not in interactions. But if you look at a theory of how interaction and information works, there are supposedly two systems. And all those two systems have is the information that arises out of those interactions. Now, the Descartesian dualism says that of those two systems, one is the knower and hence a subject, and the other is to be known and hence an object. And that is a certain reading of philosophy, a certain reading of being. But what if what you know knows you too? But that knowledge is then incomplete, because what you have is information that arises out of interactions, and then you posit two systems, the system of the self and the system of the world. And the problem of difference between reality and perception remains. For example, like one of the conditions of existence, to use this word, is that we have a continuity of phenomena, but limited discrete instruments of perception. So if we could see all the spectrum of electromagnetism, the entire spectrum, this room would appear very different. But thankfully, we only see the visible spectrum. If we could hear all that voice or sound is, this room would be a different perception. But we only hear 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Animals hear more than that. So the idea that individual is something is a historical idea with its own history. And if we are to perpetuate this idea, then we will be living in the mimetic mode. And the mimetic mode is you simply replicate what happens. And that's the mode of learning. And so you will be passing through life, and that's samsara or semiosis. But if you realize that this mimetic mode indeed leaves traces, for example, if I consume too much, I would indeed discard too much as well. Just looking at simply the archaeology of a room, I was just noting down things, and there were like 400 objects in my room. 400. Each object with its own history, and so many of them I have been mindlessly just consuming and throwing away. Now, to think that I am separate with the world means that I can keep doing it, and the world will remain the same it is, a toy to be played with. But becoming conscious of this fact, or thinking about it, thinking about what it is that we are searching when we look after desires, it is a sort of a transition from the mimetic mode to the creative mode. You're no longer somebody in the grip of mimesis, where you receive an impression and simply replicate it. But instead, you can observe what that thing is and choose not to replicate it. You can choose to engage with the world differently. You can choose to instantiate different versions of the self. And some of the things, and Professor pointed this out, the problem of symbolic logic is that it is a very small section of how we go from something like qualia or pure possibility to something like reality as emergent. Reality is not something out there, and if there is, it is beyond accumulating all the information that we have. So confusing mathematical concepts for something out there, it is a trick we use, but we should not forget that it is an invention. You do not have point masses. A point is a conceptual category. You do not have lines. A line is a conceptual category. This room, it existed in an architect's mind. It uses those categories, and it produces something which can bear certain kinds of correspondences. But to confuse it to be something out there and real, that's where that's where it's sort of like it slips into the domain of endless mimesis.
I think the problem with this way of talking and thinking is that it loses the decisive debates, the contrasts which clarify and simplify. So there are two sets of crucial debates here. One is the debate, what is the world really like? So there's one position that says the world has a basic structure. And this basic structure has the fundamental components, and then it has the regularities, the laws, the symmetries, the constants. Is that true or is that false? And we have a debate there. The claim that's being made is that's false. And the claim is made in one way by this speculative monism, and in a completely different way by the position that I call temporal naturalism. Now, the second debate is a debate about, what about us? How should we live? And it seems to me that one way of capturing the essence of this view that we're discussing is it says, it's a dramatic situation. We have to raise the shield. We have to retreat to the fortress in order to achieve some measure of serenity and control. And the other position, the opposite, is the one that says it's the opposite. We have to do the opposite. We have to cast down our shield. We have to look for trouble, not keep out of trouble. And so it's a different idea. It's an idea of transformation. Those two debates, the theoretical debate and the practical debate, are at the center here of this discussion. And everything that takes us away from that, I think we should reject, because it's losing the focus. It has to be one focus or the other focus.
That is the structuralist mode of thought. You just take the mind-body dualism. And, I totally agree with you. So within a limited time span, we can speak about these things. Laws of physics, they do work, but they work with conditions. So under these conditions, you can assume these kind of things to work a certain way. But the knowledge that you have, it's rooted in interaction. Like you cannot go and find an electron. You can find electrons' interaction with something in a certain way. So I totally agree with you when you say there is temporal naturalism. But as soon as we construct categories and concepts, we can use it in a limited set of conditions. But if we keep using those outside of those conditions, then those categories become a constraint in itself. I totally, absolutely agree with you. There is temporal realism. After all, I experience this world in so many ways. So, yeah.
So usually I'm in a situation in which my interlocutor disagrees with me and I agree with him. With you, it's the inverse.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, within the three sort of modes of orientations of existence, is there room for a fourth one? Because I was understanding it in terms of the first being Schopenhauer's kind of rejection of the will to live, the sort of affirmation of suffering in everything that exists. The second one being the Christian poets that affirm the existence of a higher providence, and the higher providence is your friend, right, in a certain sense. And the third being the kind of Chinese Confucian notion of the world being indifferent to your purposes, but is there room for a fourth that sees the world as needing to be actively critiqued and changed, something along the lines of what Marx was suggesting in, for example, the German ideology or Thesis of Feuerbach? Yeah.
presumably it would be most compatible with the third position, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I mean, we will see when we get to the Confucian teachings, I keep saying we'll put it off, but I'll say a few quick words on this. So the view is, if we assume that the world is inherently indifferent as far as we can tell, and therefore whatever structure and order exists is an order we humans have created, and if we follow that also with the argument that we should assume most of that ordering that has been done not very well and not very intelligently, usually coming out of just habits and ruts and patterns that we happen to have fallen into that have become these structures of society that can last for millennia. If we assume all of that, then the question is exactly, we are training ourselves to see how have we constructed a world, what are the implications of the ways we've constructed it, and how could it be constructed better? And then we'll look in detail at what better here means and how they would define that. But absolutely built into that is the assumption that, or we're training ourselves to see the world according to the assumption that the world of our experience is a construct and probably a really, really bad
Of course,
one.
something.
We did.
Of course, something is missing there to do what you want. What's missing is the theory of regimes. So this philosophical discussion that we're having creates a space within which we might have another debate. The other debate is the debate about the regimes. So Marx had a theory of regimes, the theory of the modes of production. And I think that his theory of regimes is problematic to my mind, because he has this idea that there are these structures, and the structures are fateful, they're decisive. But he has the wrong view of the structures. He says the structures are our creation. That's what the true part. But then he surrounds that true part with a series of false claims. He says there's a small menu, a restricted set of possible structures, the modes of production. They're all lined up in historical succession: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Each of them, now comes the second thesis, they're indivisible. When they change all at once. Consequently, politics is of two types. There's a binary idea of politics. Either it's the reformist management of one of these structures, or it's the revolutionary substitution of one structure by another. That too is false. And the third is there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these structures in history. That is false as well. So the problem is there is a theory of structures, but it's a theory of structures that's not usable by us, and that no one believes in, because that's the problem. So we have a bunch of people in the world now who use the vocabulary of this theory, but without believing in the assumptions that give meaning to those words. So they're confused. There's a confusion. So that's another task. But it seems to me that task of creating a usable theory of structures and structural change is a task that can be most appropriately executed in the context of the philosophical view that I'm calling temporal naturalism. That is, of a view that associates history comes before structure rather than the other way around. And everything in the world that exists changes and is no less real on that account.
Of course, of course.
Yeah, similarly to the question of if there's room for a fourth kind of orientation, one of the questions I had was that in my understanding of these three orientations, they seem to kind of be based on a Western philosophical notion of a subject kind of like sitting like Schopenhauer in a room considering the, like what J.L. Austin calls like the world of medium-sized dry goods, right? Like this kind of limited space of things and their relation to myself. I am wondering about an orientation to relation as primary, and whether you think this is a kind of sub-thesis of one of the existing orientations or something genuinely new? And part of why I'm asking is, I mean, for Emmanuel Levinas, for Enrique Dussel, relation becomes the kind of foreground of other forms of individuality and other forms of being, right? And it's also the means by which you recognize the kind of underclass that supports Schopenhauer sitting in his room listening to music, in much the same way that Siddhartha notices the poor, or Marx as one of the few philosophers who also kind of notices the underclass scurrying around, supporting this edifice of kind of Western philosophical mastery of the universe and its relation to myself. So is this a fourth alternative, or is this kind of a different?
I think the theory of relations is another name for a theory of regimes, because a network of relations is a regime. Now, I have to protest in defense of poor Schopenhauer, because we've here described him on several occasions as sitting in his room listening to music. Unfortunately, he had no way to listen to music. There was no electronic reproduction of music. So he would have had to have a little orchestra there playing for him.
I think for me it's an illustration of perhaps what we might say is a philosophy professor sitting in their Harvard office, right?
Yeah.
Is maybe a more accurate depiction of that orientation to philosophy.
But the music element would be missing.
Hello? Yeah, going back to the earlier question about which one of these orientations better comports with our inner desires, I feel like one thing I'm struggling with is maybe some sort of causal chicken before the egg problem, where I don't know if there really is this sort of like ultimate human, pure of any influences that has these sort of capital D desires or emotions, and we need to somehow get back to that and try to figure out which one of these orientations would better comport with that, versus a human just sort of being malleable and the product of whatever orientation he's born into, and then that sort of becoming set in stone. And then that debate aside, assuming that there is a sort of universality amongst people, then that kind of becomes a moot point too, because if these theories or orientations were made by people thousands of years ago, then they would theoretically have the same sort of desires and functions that I do, and so why am I any better than they are to decide that the orientation that I was born into that's predicated this society is wrong and needs to be changed?
I think you're taking, you're emphasizing the collective, like historical cultures and so forth. One of the things that's troubling here about these ultimate philosophical issues is the overriding role of temperament. And temperament is individual. Humanity is divided into individual temperaments. Modern social science doesn't like that. It's a category that was important in the 18th century, but doesn't figure in the 19th and 20th century. So Schopenhauer was morose, right? And depressed. And someone else is joyful and hopeful. So what are we going to do about that? So you could say, well, part of the role of thought is for you not to be in the hands of these genetic accidents, of these accidents of personal history. You should be able to react to them and to criticize them. Thus the role of thought. So you're not in the hands of this destiny. So the destiny is not just a historical or collective destiny, it's the destiny of our individual temperaments that then condemn us, as it were, to subscribe to one or another philosophical view. I cited in an early class this remark of Schopenhauer's. I said, Schopenhauer in the preface, in the introduction to the second edition of The World as Will and Representation says, my philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence. Then in Parerga and Paralipomena, he says, a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. How can these two propositions be true? That doesn't make any sense. When we have to think that there's one temperament which is the key to the understanding of reality. So philosophy must be also to be a response, to be a reaction to that. So we're not condemned, right, to this lottery of temperaments.
I want to add to his question is like, why does philosophy not like people? And instead of actually observing people's lives, it posits that people are one way or exactly the opposite of that way. Whereas in societies that exist, we find all gradations with certain commonalities, but with those commonalities, societies create totally different understandings of the world. But philosophy does not like to be with people. It thinks it can retreat in its own self, the all-knowing self, and somehow come up with transcendental laws of human existence, as well as social relations. So the point goes back to the earlier point about looking at this relatedness as it unfolds, instead of positing received concepts and like framing the world within those sort of like small squares.
So I keep saying we'll hold off on Confucianism, but I keep bringing things in. So let me bring in yet again just a few things, but directly relevant. So part of what will be intriguing about the Confucian response to all of these concerns is it will say, the world that we perceive to be these individual things is a construct. Now, that's an idea we've, of course, seen played out in other ways, but the reason I'm bringing up the Confucian move in this is they will say, understand, and it also touches on Steve's earlier question, it's relationships all the way down. So what I become as a human being depends often on just sets of relationships I fall into. Those can be based upon the customs of the society I'm born into, habits and patterns of relationship building that I happen to fall into for utterly random reasons, and yet those can completely define me. Insofar as that is the case, the goal is to say, you are trying to work to build better relationships, because if we're all, as they will often say, kind of messes all the way down and what we become depends on these relationships, it's all about trying to build better relationships. And as I mentioned, we'll deal with the whole question of how they will define better. That will be a very powerful question. But I mention all of this to say it really is seen as a question of building relationships, rethinking relationships we're existing in, both at a mundane level, but at a much larger societal level too, precisely by pushing down against the idea that we are simply already individuals who need to decide how to live. That set of assumptions, I'm an individual making these decisions, is already based upon this whole series of relationships, some of which are going to be so dangerous that they will utterly imperil any decision that we will make from that paradigm. So very much underlining your point.
I guess related to these questions on like relations, I'm curious, I don't know if I disagree with this, but I'm curious if there's an kind of underlining assumption about the amount of agency we have as individuals in choosing a conduct of life, as well as an assumption about life as an experience, as an individual experience itself as well.
Well, presumably, so let me ask you a question about your question. So presumably there isn't a fixed amount of agency, right? You could say many people or most people have little agency because they've resigned themselves to their fate. And the question that we're really asking is not how much agency do people possess, as if it were a fixed quantity. The question is, how much should they fight for more agency? And by what means should they fight? That was the question about whether you simply have one of these three pre-philosophical attitudes that I described, and then you say, well, that's it. That's the one I ended up with in this lottery, which is like a contemporary version of this monstrous lottery of the Indo-European formula. That's my karma. So that's, as it were, the limiting position. And the question is, by what means and to what extent can we go beyond this limiting position? The assumption is that we have almost no agency for the most part unless we struggle for it.
And yet, let me underline this by saying, I actually think all three orientations would, albeit in radically different ways, agree with this position. All three would say one of our fundamental dangers as human beings is we tend to simply live our lives according to the customs we happen to be born into, the temperament we happen to have, and in the Confucian version, the relationships and patterns and habits we happen to have fallen into, and most of us simply live our lives that way. And so it's not only possible to live our lives that way, the view is pretty much all of us do, and all three would say this is absolutely wrong, and all three would say dramatically rethink all of these assumptions. Now, needless to say, they will define agency in totally different ways, which is part of what makes this the exercise of this class so powerful, we hope.
And that's where Western philosophy began.
Absolutely.
In the Platonic remark,
yes,
the unexamined life is not worth living.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so all would say it's about increasing agency. Now, again, they'll define agency radically differently. And let me say a few words on this position we're discussing today and we're discussing yesterday, because there, of course, it's an agency in part by denying the kind of agency we usually take for granted. But even here, let me say a few more words about Schopenhauer's relationship to Buddhism, because it's very intriguing on this issue. So we're noting the tremendous differences that he's doing when in the way he reads Buddhism. One other one we haven't touched on fully yet, but let me say a few more words about in relationship to this issue. He, of course, will completely reject any discussion of reincarnation and karma. And note the implications of this. So in Buddhism, the reason karma is being pushed, it's a radical rethinking of the notion of karma from the earlier Indo-European societies. And the early Buddhist rethinking of it is to say, understand my way of living a life, which again is based upon this construct that I have created through my acts of will, based on my most base desires, that is creating a world of suffering, not just among the immediate people around me, not just the servants and working in Siddhartha's to keep Siddhartha's happiness in his palace before he achieves enlightenment, but the repercussions of that will continue for eons. So the suffering that creates will affect their families, their social worlds, even after they are dead. That suffering will continue. So it's radically upping the ante on the amount of suffering I am causing on a constant basis. And precisely because of that, the push, once you begin to realize this, is toward this absolute universal compassion, which is not, again, the retreating into my room with the, you're right, music in the head, but still, it's all about these incredibly self-sacrificing acts. We mentioned putting your self-immolation, these things that if I can undergo the discipline to break down these notions of self, I will then have the universal compassion to act on behalf of living beings at a level that the rest of us caught in this world of suffering could never do. Now, note again, when Schopenhauer drops all of that out, suffering largely becomes his personal suffering, and his personal suffering is going to be extinguished by, again, sitting in his room. Now, again, I don't want to be unfair. He does do charity work, but it's pretty minimal. I mean, by Buddhist standards, he spends a lot of time enjoying life, well, he's morosely not enjoying, morosely being depressed in his room. And so that has a huge implication. Now, getting back to the heart of your question, that is a radically different vision of what we could use, putting it in scare quotes, agency, even though, of course, that term is precisely what's under question in these traditions. And yet, the implications of questioning agency are both, getting back to the heart of your question, about rejecting the world in which we currently live and all of the assumptions we make within it. So in that specific sense, it's a radical increase of agency in the sense that you are trying to break the world, well, in the Buddhist sense, break the world of suffering that we are actively a part of causing. Yeah, please, of course.
Are there any philosophies then that you, like as you said, all three do kind of push you to reject the assumptions that you have, but are there philosophies that don't push for that, that kind of just like accept who you are right now as well?
I would say,
What?
so if all three are pushing us to break our set of assumptions and break the customary worlds in which we're born, are there others that would say the opposite, accept them? And I would say, sadly, by implication, not by intent, but by implication, most social theories that are dominant today, that is exactly what they do. Again, not by intent, but that's
opposed to philosophy.
yes, exactly. And I think that is exactly what they do.
Philosophically, we would associate that with, for example, with Burke. There are political philosophies that accept the sovereignty of custom. But the general attitude of in the history of philosophy is the solvent. Habit, custom, practice are what people do when they're not philosophical. Once they're philosophical, they have the torch, and they're going to burn down the edifice of custom. And then there's a very narrow faction of philosophers who are like the Trojan horse of society inside philosophy, who want to reevaluate custom. But all the others are against them. And even if they have the theory of custom, so take a philosopher like Wittgenstein, you could say, theoretically, he's a defender of custom. In practice, it's the opposite, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the reason we keep emphasizing philosophy over social theory is note the degree to which most of our dominant social theories, which are commonly taught in classes for all the obvious reasons, but the implication of them, not the intent, but the implication of them is exactly that. We saw this with the school philosophies, where the claim is we're going to debate the big ethical questions of the day, but as we notice in practice, they're doing the exact opposite. The whole working is you cut out all the big questions and you simply create these situations where it's all about, do I make a utilitarian decision within this context where I don't question the self, I don't question the context, and one can expand that point. So the reason we are here doing philosophy, in the sense that we're using the term, and not social theory, is social theory tends to do exactly what you're asking in, we would say, a horribly dangerous way. Now, on this point, as we move to our closing seconds, let me first say a very quick note to the undergraduates. Thank you for your papers. We are enjoying them very much. We will be getting those back to you very soon. And to everyone else, we will indeed be returning to this question of agency in a dramatically different way next week, where we will return to rereadings of the Christian tradition. Again, as we've noted, our syllabus is intentionally jumping through centuries and across geographies and what we hope will be exciting juxtapositions.
But next week we begin the study of two contemporary ethics, right?
Yes, which are breaking
Visions.
out of these metaphysical ideas.
It's a different idea, that now there's a debate in the world between two views of human existence. And each of these views has a privileged relation with one of the two superpowers in the world.
And next week, we will turn to visions of self-fashioning, building on aspects of the Christian tradition in a very radical rereading of them, and we will discuss the implications. And then, as Roberto has mentioned, thereafter, we will finally turn to the thing we've been hinting at repeatedly today, the Confucian tradition, and look at a very, very different vision. And then we will discuss, as Roberto said, these two as two of the dominant positions in the world today.
But on your question of habit, custom, remember what Hegel said. Hegel said, philosophy is revolutionary even when it appears to be reactionary. And this is the reason.
Thank you so much, and see you next week.